You do not need to be healed to heal. That is the central claim of this video. And it is also the central claim of one of the most important archetypes in all of Jungian psychology, the wounded healer. The idea is this: the thing that broke you is also the source of your capacity to be genuinely present with someone else who is breaking, not despite the wound, through it. If you have ever been the person everyone calls when they are in crisis, if you have an unusual ability to sit with darkness without flinching, to be present with suffering in a way that other people cannot sustain, and if you have ever traced that capacity back far enough to discover that it came from your own wound, then this video is about the psychology of what you already know from the inside. Jung called it the wounded healer, and what he understood about it, about how the wound becomes a calling, about what happens when the wound is not known, and about the specific kind of hope that only a wounded healer can offer, is what this video is about. Jung encountered this pattern so consistently in his clinical work and so profoundly in his own life that he gave it an archetypal name, the wounded healer. The archetype has ancient roots. Chiron in Greek mythology was the centaur who taught healing to gods and heroes while carrying an incurable wound of his own, a wound that could not be healed by the very knowledge he transmitted to others. Asclepius, the god of medicine, was raised by Chiron and carried the same paradox, the capacity to heal others emerging not despite the wound but through it. Jung saw in these myths not simply stories, but structural descriptions of a psychological truth that appeared with striking regularity in the people who were drawn to healing work, and in himself. The counterintuitive truth at the center of the wounded healer archetype is this: the wound is not an obstacle to the healing capacity. It is its source. The healer who has not been wounded can offer knowledge, technique, competence. What they cannot offer, what only the wounded healer can offer, is the specific quality of presence that comes from having been in the darkness and having found a way to survive it. Not to resolve it, not to transcend it, to survive it, to integrate it, and to be changed by it in ways that make genuine accompaniment of another person's darkness possible. This is what makes the wounded healer different from the simply competent healer, and it is also what makes the wounded healer's work more dangerous, both for the people they help and for themselves, if the wound is not known. This video is about the archetype of the wounded healer in Jung's psychology, what it means, where it comes from, how it operates in the lives of people drawn to healing and caregiving, and what Jung understood about the difference between a wound that is known and integrated and a wound that is unknown, and therefore running the healer's work from the shadow. It is a video for anyone who has ever found themselves consistently drawn to others' suffering, and who has wondered honestly whether the calling and the wound are the same thing. Jung did not develop the concept of the wounded healer from a purely theoretical position. He lived it, with a directness and a willingness to document the living of it that remains, a century later, genuinely extraordinary. The period between 1913 and 1917, the years following his rupture with Freud, which he described as a voluntary confrontation with the unconscious, was, by his own account, a period of profound psychological crisis. He experienced visions. He heard voices. He documented encounters with figures from the unconscious that, in another person, might have warranted a clinical diagnosis. He was, in the most precise sense, wounded. And he was simultaneously, in those same years, doing some of the most original psychological work of the 20th century. What Jung understood from his own experience was something that changed the entire architecture of his psychology. The therapist who has not passed through their own darkness cannot genuinely accompany another person through theirs. This is not a moral claim. It is a structural one. The therapist who has not been in the wound operates from the outside of the patient's experience, offering maps to territory they have never inhabited. The therapist who has been in the wound operates from the inside, not because their wound is the same as the patient's, but because the experience of having been in darkness and having survived it produces a quality of presence that cannot be simulated by knowledge or technique. It is transmitted, Jung believed, through something more fundamental than words, through the unconscious field between two people, in which the therapist's own integration of their wound becomes, in ways that resist precise description, available to the patient. Picture a young Jung in his consulting room in the early years of his practice. Technically trained, intellectually brilliant, already producing theoretical work that exceeded everything his contemporaries were doing, and genuinely limited in a specific way that he would only recognize later. He had not yet been broken, had not yet passed through the experience that would teach him, from the inside, what it means to lose orientation, to encounter the depths of the unconscious not as theory but as lived reality, to survive the encounter and emerge changed. The crisis years were not an interruption of his work. They were the completion of his formation as a healer. The wound was not something that happened to Jung, the man, separately from Jung, the psychologist. It was the central event of his development as the specific kind of healer he became. Jung was explicit about the implication for clinical practice. The therapist must know their own wound, must have done and must continue doing the work of encountering what is in their own shadow, their own unconscious, their own unintegrated material. Not because this makes them perfect or fully healed. The wounded healer is never fully healed, and that is part of the point. But because the wound that is unknown does not disappear. It operates. It enters the clinical relationship invisibly, shaping what the therapist can and cannot be present with, what they unconsciously avoid, what they project onto the patient, what they need from the patient in ways they cannot acknowledge. The unexamined wound is not the source of the healing capacity. It is its saboteur. The path from wound to vocation is rarely conscious. It does not announce itself as a decision. It presents itself as a pull, a persistent attraction towards certain kinds of people, certain kinds of situations, certain kinds of suffering that feel, from the inside, more like recognition than choice. The child who grew up in a family system organized around emotional chaos, and who becomes the therapist who specializes in attachment and trauma. The person who spent years living with a parent's addiction, and who becomes the counselor who works most effectively with families of addicts. The individual who survived the particular darkness of depression and who finds, years later, that they have an unusual ability to sit with depressed patients in a way that other clinicians cannot. In each case, the vocation grew from the wound, not as a direct translation but as a transformation, in which the raw material of suffering was metabolized into the refined capacity for presence. Jung would describe this transformation through the concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to produce something new from the encounter between opposites, in this case between the wound and the will to heal. The wound alone does not produce the vocation. The wound encountered, worked with, and partially integrated, brought into relationship with the conscious intention to use what the suffering taught, produces something that neither the wound nor the intention could have produced alone. This is why not everyone who has suffered becomes a healer. Suffering is the raw material. The work of integration is the process. The vocation is the result. And it is only available to those who have done enough of the second to transform the first into something that can be genuinely offered rather than simply transmitted as unprocessed pain. Here is what the pull toward vocation actually feels like from the inside, in the specific moment when it operates. A person is at a gathering and someone begins to describe something difficult. A loss, a struggle, a confusion about their own life. Most people in the room shift slightly, register mild discomfort, look for the moment when they can offer the reassurance that will return the conversation to more manageable territory. The future healer does the opposite. Something in them moves toward the difficulty rather than away from it. Not because difficulty is pleasurable, but because something in the difficult territory feels familiar, feels like ground they have walked before, where they know how to move. The recognition is not intellectual. It is somatic. The wound recognizes the wound, and the capacity that was built in the long experience of the wound's own territory becomes available, in that moment, as a genuine gift. The danger in this pull, and it is a danger that Jung named directly, is that the vocation organized around the wound can become a way of managing the wound rather than integrating it. Picture what this looks like from the inside. A therapist who, after a particularly difficult week in her own life, finds herself scheduling extra sessions, volunteering for the most complex cases, staying late to answer emails from clients in crisis. From the outside, it looks like dedication. From the inside, if she were honest, something else is operating. A specific relief that comes from being in the position of the one who helps, the one who is needed, the one whose own pain is irrelevant, because there is always someone whose pain is more acute. The orientation toward others' suffering is not false. The care is genuine. But it is also, in that specific week, doing something else, keeping her own wound at a safe distance from direct encounter. The healer who is always helping is sometimes the healer who cannot stop helping long enough to face what is still unhealed in themselves. And the vocation, which is also a genuine calling, has become its most sophisticated disguise. Every archetype has a shadow, the dimension of the pattern that operates when the archetype is lived unconsciously rather than consciously. The shadow of the wounded healer is not rare or difficult to recognize once it is named. It is, in fact, one of the most common patterns in the helping professions, and one of the most consistently unaddressed, because the helping professions have historically been more interested in what the healer does for others than in what the healer does to themselves and, through themselves, to the people they are trying to help. The shadow of the healer is the wound that is still running, the unintegrated suffering that enters the healing relationship dressed as competence, as empathy, as dedication, in ways that serve the healer's own unmet needs rather than the genuine needs of the person seeking help. The most common manifestation of the healer's shadow is what is clinically called countertransference. The healer's own unconscious material being activated by the patient's material and entering the relationship in ways the healer cannot see because it is happening below the threshold of their awareness. The therapist who becomes inexplicably irritated with a patient who makes no progress, and whose irritation is the activation of their own wound around being trapped. The counselor who feels a pull to rescue a client from a situation the client is not yet ready to leave, and whose urgency is the echo of the child who could not rescue their own parent. The healer who needs their patient to get better more than the patient needs to get better, because the patient's healing is unconsciously serving as proof that the healer's own wound was survivable, that the darkness that formed them was not terminal. Picture a therapist 15 years into her practice, genuinely skilled, genuinely dedicated, with real results across hundreds of clients, and a specific pattern she has never examined. The clients she finds most compelling, most worth her full attention, most alive in her imagination between sessions, are consistently the ones who are most severely wounded. The mildly struggling client receives competent, adequate care. The profoundly broken client receives something different, an intensity of presence, a depth of investment, an almost personal quality of commitment that the therapist could not explain if asked to. What she has not examined is the obvious. The profoundly broken client activates something in her own wound that the adequately struggling client does not. The depth of her engagement is real, and it is also, in a way she cannot yet see, about her. The shadow of the healer also manifests in the specific blindness that the wound produces, the areas of human experience that the healer cannot be genuinely present with because they are too close to unintegrated material in the healer's own psyche. The healer who grew up with rage in the family and who consistently, subtly moves clients away from their own anger, not because anger is clinically contraindicated, but because the healer's own relationship with anger is unresolved, and anger in the room activates something in them that they manage by managing it in the client. Every healer has these areas. The question is not whether they exist, but whether the healer knows where they are, and whether the work of knowing them is ongoing. The Chiron myth contains a detail that most modern presentations of the wounded healer archetype underemphasize or elide entirely. A detail that is, in Jung's reading of it, not incidental but central. Chiron's wound was incurable. The centaur who taught healing to gods and heroes could not heal himself. The wound that was the source of his extraordinary knowledge and his extraordinary capacity for accompaniment was also the wound that never closed, that remained open, painful, the permanent condition of his existence as a healer. Jung took this seriously, not as tragedy but as structural truth about what the wound in the wounded healer actually is. The wound that becomes a vocation is not a wound that heals in the conventional sense, that closes, resolves, ceases to be a wound. It is a wound that is integrated, which is different. Integration does not mean the absence of pain. It means the pain has been metabolized into something that can be carried consciously rather than operated unconsciously. The integrated wound is still present, still sensitive, still capable of being activated, still the permanent feature of the healer's psychological landscape that it always was. What has changed is the healer's relationship to it. The integrated wound is known. It is named. Its triggers are recognized rather than blindly enacted. And its energy, the energy that was bound in the unprocessed suffering, has been gradually released into the capacity for genuine presence that defines the wounded healer at their best. This is one of the most important things that can be said about the experience of the wounded healer, and one of the most rarely said, because it contradicts the narrative of healing as resolution that permeates the helping professions. You do not need to be healed to heal. You need to be honest about your wound. There is a specific kind of liberation in this that is not available in the narrative of healing as resolution. The liberation of not needing to perform wholeness, of not needing to present as someone who has arrived somewhere beyond the suffering that formed you. The wounded healer who knows their wound and carries it honestly is more genuinely helpful than the healer who has performed their way to an apparent wholeness that is actually a more sophisticated version of the false self. Patients know the difference, they always know. Imagine a therapist who, after 20 years of practice and 20 years of his own analysis, sits with a patient in the specific darkness of grief and says, quietly and without performance, "I know this place. I have been here. I cannot take you out of it. No one can. But I can tell you that there is a way through, because I found mine. Not the same way. Not a way that will look like mine, but a way." This is not a technique. It is not a therapeutic intervention. It is the wounded healer offering what only the wounded healer can offer: testimony. The witness of someone who has been in the wound and survived it, not intact, not unchanged, but alive and present and still here. But sustaining the capacity to offer that testimony, keeping the wound integrated rather than defended, keeping the presence genuine rather than performed, is its own ongoing work. And it is work that the wounded healer is, by temperament and by training, often the last person to ask for help with. There is a specific crisis that visits most wounded healers at some point in the arc of their work. A crisis that is, in Jung's framework, not a sign that something has gone wrong, but a sign that something necessary is being demanded. It is the crisis of the healer who can no longer sustain the orientation toward others' suffering because their own wound, inadequately attended to, has become too heavy to carry. The burnout, the compassion fatigue, the sudden incapacity to be present that was once effortless, these are not simply occupational hazards of the helping professions. They are the wound's communication that it has been serving the healer's vocation without being adequately received by the healer themselves. The wounded healer who helps without receiving help, who maintains the orientation toward others' suffering without ever fully turning toward their own, is not being noble. They are enacting in a more sophisticated form the same avoidance that organized the wound in the first place. The child who became the family's emotional caretaker learned that their own needs were secondary to the needs of those around them. The adult healer who cannot receive care, who deflects, minimizes, redirects, who is always the helper and never the helped, is living the same structure in a context that gives it a socially valorized form. The vocation has become the defense, and the defense has to be named before the wound underneath it can receive what it has always needed. Picture a therapist in her mid-40s who has spent 15 years being genuinely, skillfully helpful to hundreds of clients, and who sits in her own therapist's office, unable to receive what is being offered, who intellectualizes when the conversation gets close to her own pain, who deflects with clinical observations about her own process, who, when her therapist names what is happening, says with the fluency of someone who has been trained to recognize the pattern in others, I know I do this," and does not, in that moment, actually feel what she knows. The knowledge is real. The wound is still defended. And the defense is so fluent, so clinically sophisticated, so indistinguishable from genuine insight, that it takes her another 2 years of her own work to actually feel what she has been knowing about for a decade. Jung's insistence on the analyst's own analysis, on the requirement that the healer submit to the same process they ask of those they help, was grounded precisely in this recognition, not as a ritual requirement but as a structural necessity. The healer who has not genuinely been the patient, who has not genuinely occupied the position of the one who needs, the one who cannot see, the one who is in the wound without map or exit, cannot fully offer genuine accompaniment to someone in that position. The experience of having been helped, genuinely helped, in the specific way that the wounded healer helps others, is part of what makes the healing real. The healer is not above the process. They are inside it, permanently, necessarily, as the condition of their work. The integration of the wound in the wounded healer is not a project that completes. It is a practice that deepens. There is always more wound to know, always more shadow to examine, always more of the unprocessed material that formed the healer, and that continues to enter their work in ways that ongoing self-examination makes visible. Jung described this not as a burden, but as the condition of genuine psychological work. The condition that keeps the healer honest, that prevents the accumulated competence and authority of years of practice from calcifying into a certainty that has lost contact with the living uncertainty of actual human experience. The healer who is still in their own process is the healer who still knows what it is to not know. The first dimension of integration that the wounded healer must sustain is what Jung called the examined life, the ongoing practice of self-reflection that keeps the wound visible rather than allowing it to sink back into unconscious operation. This is not the same as ongoing suffering. It is the ongoing willingness to know where the wound is, what activates it, how it enters the work, and what it needs from the healer as a human being rather than as a function. The healer who knows their wound with this specificity, who can say in a given session, I notice that this patient's material is activating something in me that I need to attend to separately, is the healer whose wound is serving the work rather than corrupting it. The second dimension is the practice of receiving, the ongoing, often countercultural commitment of the healer to allow themselves to be helped, known, cared for, held. Here is what this looks like in practice. Specifically, a therapist in her own session with her own analyst who allows herself to not know the answer to a question about her own life, who does not reflexively reach for the clinical frame, who sits in the uncertainty without filling it with insight, and discovers in that specific moment of not knowing that she is receiving something she has not allowed herself to receive in years. The experience of being genuinely accompanied rather than perpetually the one who accompanies. This moment, unremarkable from the outside, profound from the inside, is the practice of receiving. It is the structural maintenance of the wounded healer's capacity, the replenishment of the resource that the work draws from. The healer who never occupies this position eventually has nothing genuine left to give, only competence, professionalism, technical adequacy, drained of the living presence that was the wound's actual gift. The third dimension is perhaps the most difficult and the most important, the practice of hope that is not optimism. The wounded healer who has done genuine work with their own wound arrives at a specific kind of hope that is different from the hope that preceded the wounding, different from the hope that had not yet been tested by genuine darkness. It is a hope that knows what it is hoping against, that has looked at the darkness without flinching and chosen, with full knowledge of what it was choosing, to believe that the through is possible, not that it is easy, not that it is guaranteed, but that it exists, that there is a way through the wound that does not require its erasure, that the integrated wound is not the end of the story but a different, more complete, more honestly earned beginning. There is a quality that the genuinely integrated wounded healer carries that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has been in its presence. A quality that is not performed, not claimed, not the result of training or technique, but is simply there, in the way they inhabit their work and the space around it. It is the quality of someone who has been in the darkness and who, because of that, is not afraid of yours, who does not need you to be further along than you are, who does not need your wound to resolve on a timeline that is comfortable for them, who can sit with you in the not yet without the specific anxious helpfulness that characterizes the healer whose own wound is still running the work. This quality, this unfrightened presence, is the wound's greatest gift, and it cannot be produced any other way. Jung believed that the psyche's movement toward wholeness, toward individuation, toward the genuine self, was not primarily the result of technique or knowledge. It was the result of encounter, of the specific experience of being genuinely met by another human being who had been where you are and who, in the meeting, transmitted something that could not be articulated but was received. The lived knowledge that the darkness is survivable, that the wound is not terminal, that what broke you is also what is forming you into something that could not have existed without the breaking. The wounded healer is the vehicle for this transmission, not because they have the right words or the right method, but because they carry, in their own integrated wound, the living testimony that the patient needs to encounter. The wounded healer's work is ultimately an act of hope, but it is the specific kind of hope that only the wound makes possible. Not the hope of someone who has never been broken, who offers reassurance from the position of someone who has not needed what they are offering. The hope of someone who has been in the place where hope was not visible and who found in that specific darkness something to hold on to. Not a solution, not a rescue, not a resolution of the wound's conditions, but a way of being present inside the wound that gradually, non-linearly, over more time than felt bearable, transformed it into something that could be carried. This is what the wounded healer offers. Not healing in the sense of erasure, accompaniment in the sense of genuine presence. The difference between those two things is the whole of what makes the work real. If you have recognized yourself in this video, if the description of the pull toward others' suffering, the wound underneath the vocation, the difficulty of receiving what you offer so freely to others, has the quality of something lived rather than observed, then there is something worth sitting with in the closing of this video. Your wound is not a disqualification. It is not something to overcome before you can be genuinely useful. It is the source. The thing that happened to you, that broke something, that cost something, that left a mark that is not fully closed, is also the thing that makes you capable of the specific presence that no unwounded healer can offer. You do not need to be healed to heal. You need to know your wound, and knowing it, honestly, specifically with the same quality of attention you offer to the wounds of others, is the work of a lifetime that is also always enough.